Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to Ohele Avotenu, Tents of Our Fathers. So today this is a commentary about Parshat Emor, and we're going to be talking about some of the lies and half-truths that come out of Christendom, come out of religious circles and religion generally. The difference between rules for thee and not for me, what it means to be holy, and whether or not those standards apply to everyone the same way. So, just diving in. On the one hand, I've heard it said, God doesn't care where you come from. It doesn't matter who you were before. It doesn't matter what you did before. It doesn't matter the life you lived before. There's no limits what he can do with you, how he can use you, all those kinds of things. And I think there is some truth to the statement, but there's also the reality that it's overbroad, right? There are some things that he has very much an interest in where you come from and what you've done before and who you are and who you were, and some things that you cannot do if you are a certain person. And that doesn't mean he can't use you in other ways, but in this passage, for example, we are confronted with the standard of holiness for priests. Now, for starters, if you're not a son of Aaron, if you're not a son of Levi, you're not going to be functioning as a high priest. That's not going to happen. So let's say you are the son of Amalekites and you have an encounter with the Most High of Israel, and you say, you know what? I will serve the God of Israel all my days. Well, that'd be awesome. And amazing, and yet you will never be the high priest. And it doesn't mean that your salvation is in question. It doesn't mean that there's no ability for you to be used for his kingdom, say, but you will not be able to hold that particular office. Likewise, a high priest is not allowed to marry somebody who is not a virgin. He has to marry a virgin of his people in Israel. And the priests generally have higher rules as it comes to who they marry. Now, on the one hand, this should be obvious, right? We have passages which talk about leaders being held, teachers being held to a higher standard, a higher account. So that makes sense. But the flip side of that is taking it too far, right? And this is where we get into rules for thee, but not for me. Many people talk about, executive privilege, right? Leaders who get a little more license to do things or a little more leeway on certain ideas because they need the flexibility to function in certain regards. And they'll often cite things like, do not muzzle the ox while it treads the grain. And okay, yet when you're talking about muzzling an ox while it treads the grain, you're not giving the ox license to just gobble up all your food stores. The scripture says, that he who does not work does not eat. And of course, I'm paraphrasing. So those who do the work should partake of the eating, right? They should be sustained by the work that they're doing. Imagine taking a servant of the Most High and expecting them to plow your fields and then starve in the process. That's not acceptable. That's not a right way to deal with that individual. It should not be a license to say, okay, you plow the fields, you common man, and let me, the leader, eat all the grain. That's also not what it's getting at, in my very strong opinion. But do rules for thee, but not for me, apply? Yes, and that is a little bit of a two-way street. And today I want to talk about some of the aspects of leadership which are more restrictive. So not executive privilege, but executive restriction. right? Things which leaders are not allowed to do. And for example, the high priest, he's not allowed to marry somebody who's not a virgin. The priests generally are supposed to avoid defiled women. They are allowed to marry widows of priests. We see that in the Haftarah portion. But let's just say, we take the standard of a leader, right? We say, well, the high priest is the most holy office in Israel, and therefore, since I want to be holy unto the Lord, I, I and everybody else, every good believer, every person who desires towards righteousness must uphold the same standard. Okay. Well, this creates a problem. Why? Because if all the men in Israel get on this particular line of thinking, this particular um, doctrine of a rule, a binding obligation on a high priest should apply to everyone, right? We must all aspire to the highest levels of holiness, the highest levels of leadership in the camp. Then you're going to end up neglecting other aspects of the Torah, taking care of the widows and orphans, for example. If, let's say, Boaz had decided he was going to be righteous like the high priest, and he was never ever going to marry a widow, then what would have happened to the widow, right? Of what was it, Machlon or Kilion? The Moabite girl Ruth, right? What would have happened to her? She was a widow, right? She was a widow who was reliant upon the levirate marriage, that if her husband dies, then one of his near relatives would take her and marry her and provide for her and raise up seed. That is righteousness in Torah. That is a way of upholding the rights of another human in Torah, and not just the rights of the woman, but the rights of the deceased man in Israel, so that his name doesn't disappear from the camp. So it's kind of like the Pharisees saying, if you dedicate your the honor that you owe your parents to the Lord as korban, then you can't do anything more for your parents. It's like, okay, so what you're saying is you're taking a vow to not uphold certain aspects of the Torah, right? Out of a misguided sense of holiness. And that's not exactly what we're supposed to do. Now, a high priest might not be able to be the relative who acts in a levirate function, but if nobody is able to function in that way, then we've got a real problem on our hands. So what happens is sometimes people get these ideas about marriage, and some of it comes from the writings of Paul. Paul, as Peter says, wrote many things that are difficult to understand, which untrained and undisciplined people twist to their own destruction. And I think it's one of the reasons why we see some of the doctrines of men which have come out of certain branches of Christendom that say priests should not get married at all, right? So they can occupy themselves with the work of the Lord. And to my mind, it comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of the scriptures themselves. In this passage, we have a whole list of who the priests are supposed to marry. So if God didn't want priests to marry at all, so that they could be um, focused on the words and the works and the mission and whatever of the kingdom, then this passage wouldn't exist. It would be a pointless passage, and God would well, he would be contradicting himself and sounding like he doesn't know what he's talking about or what he's doing or whatever. but God doesn't change. He knows what he meant, and it's up to us to try to seek it out, right? It's the glory of God to conceal a matter. It is the glory of kings to search it out. So, what does that mean when it comes to the words of Paul? Well, Paul writes some real interesting stuff regarding marriage, right? I'm not going to read the entire passages. I'm going to read snippets to kind of show how the reading might be a little confusing if you go through it, because he does a lot of on the one hand this, on the other hand that, back and forth and back and forth. And if you're thinking, okay, is it sin to get married? Is it sin to not get married? Which is it? Is it both? Is it either? Is it neither? And before we get into the actual words of Paul, remember this: Paul cannot add to the law, right? He cannot give any new commandments. He cannot change the law. He cannot reduce the law. So what he does is he's giving his commentary on the law, and I'll demonstrate that from the text itself. One of the things that Paul does is he often makes a distinction between what he is saying and what God is saying, right? What his opinion is, what he's writing, and what the Spirit of God is saying. So let's get into 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And again, I'm reading snippets. Read the entire passage for yourself. Get the context. This is merely a demonstration to show how it seems a bit like he's going back and forth and like he can't make up his mind on the matter. But I'm going to circle it back around to what I believe he's trying to say, and I will provide the verse that I think he's actually discussing. So 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 40. Read the whole chapter, get the context, do the things. These are just snippets. So each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. So this is, you do this, you're supposed to do this, right? The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise the wife also to her husband. Again, this is what you're supposed to do, right? That's what it sounds like. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows that it is good for them if they remain even as I. Wait, so if you're a virgin and a widow, don't get married? But I thought you just said every man should have his own husband, or his own wife, and every woman should have her own husband, right? So get married or don't get married. Now concerning virgins, now this is important. I have no command of the Lord, but I am offering direction, right? So again, he's not adding to the law. He's not taking from the law. He is giving a perspective. He's saying, this isn't from the Lord. This is from me, right? And it's important to remember that, because a lot of people, they say, well, everything Genesis to Revelation comes from God. Well, if this bit says that it's not from the Lord, do you believe it or do you believe your doctrine, right? Which is it? Because if it's from the Lord, but he says this command is not from the Lord, which is it? So, I mean, just throwing it out there, it's a little conundrum for you to figure out. I choose to believe Paul when he says that this is from him, not from the Lord, and that he's giving his opinion. I'm going to go where I think he's going with this. So, now concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord, but I am offering direction. And skipping forward again, are you released from a wife? Do not seek a wife. So again, don't get married. But if you marry, you have not sinned. So, okay, don't seek a wife. So that seems an instruction. But if you do get married, you've not sinned. So that's like, this is my guidance, this is my instruction, but if you don't listen to me, it's not actually a sin, right? So again, it's not from the Lord. This is his opinion. But I want you to be free from concern. One who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how he may please his wife, and his interests are divided. And now this is a very key passage, and we're going to come back to it in a minute. We have more interesting things that he says about marriage, confusing for some. I think I understand them. In First Timothy, also in Titus, but in First Timothy, we're going to focus on that one today. Chapter 3, verses 1 through 4:4. Again, read the entire thing, get the context. I'm just doing snippets to kind of show the basic ideas. So this is the one where, Paul is writing about the qualifications for elders and leaders and deacons, and he's saying that a leader must be the husband of one wife. And again, later on in the passage, he's saying, I am writing these things to you, right? And then as he continues in chapter 4, and remember, there's no division in the ancient texts. He says, so he's saying, I'm writing these things to you because X, Y, and Z. And then he goes on to say, but the Spirit explicitly says, and then he says something else. So again, he's making that same distinction, right? Like he did in Corinthians, between this is from me, this is from the Lord, or this is from the Lord, and this is from me. He makes that distinction whenever he is giving personal opinion, much like I do. This is commentary, right? This is opinion. Read the passages for yourself, okay? So why is Paul saying these things about marriage? Are we supposed to get married or are we not supposed to get married? Right? If we're supposed to be fruitful and multiply and fill all the earth, right? The creation ideal that a lot of people talk about, they say, well, the creation ideal is one man and one woman. They get married, and this is upholding the pattern of the ages. And it's like, all right, well, is Paul then inviting and encouraging people to sin? Is he saying that don't get married, don't fulfill the mitzvah, don't do the things? Is he directing people to violate the creation ideal by saying it's better if you just don't get married? It's better to not do these things? I don't believe so, and I'll explain why. A lot of people, they look at the Timothy passage, the Titus passage, and they say, okay, well, you see, leaders are supposed to be the husband of only one wife, right? And there are people who dispute that translation, but I'm not even going to do that because I actually think that's what Paul was saying. But why would he be saying it? If he's not allowed to add extra law, he's not allowed to bind new restrictions on the people. And a lot of people will hail back to the Deuteronomy 17 passage about the law of kings and how a king is not supposed to multiply wives for himself, greatly multiply. The word being rabbah, which is linked to the swarming locust. So why would he be saying this, right? Because, well, that's just a law for kings. I heard someone say the other day that a high priest is forbidden from marrying two wives. Shout out to Rico Cortez. I'm still waiting for you to show me that passage in the Torah because I don't remember reading it. But hey, whatever. Um, and if your response is going to continue to be to me, just do your own research, bro. Yeah, I have, and I still don't remember reading that passage. I'm open to correction, but I don't remember reading it. Please show me where it exists that the Torah says a high priest cannot have two wives. I've never read this, but okay. Deuteronomy 17, king may not, greatly multiply wives to himself. Timothy, Titus, leader must be the husband of one wife. Why? Why might this be a thing? Well, it's very simple in my mind, a very simple answer. And that answer is Deuteronomy 24:5, right? And this one I'll read the direct quote. When a man takes a new wife, he is not to go out with the army, nor be assigned any duty. He shall be free at home for 1 year, and shall make his wife, whom he has taken, happy. Okay? What does this mean? What this means is when you take a wife unto yourself, You have a duty and a responsibility to her to be concerned with her interests, to be concerned with pleasing her, to be concerned with making her happy for an entire year, right? If um, somebody says, "Hey, we got to go out and make war against the Amalekites. We have to go and fight the Canaanites. We have to go and deal with Hamas or you know uh, the Iranian terrorist regime, whatever the case may be." You're not supposed to engage in those things. You're supposed to bring happiness to this woman of yours, this wife that you've taken for the first year. And it's her right, okay? And it's your duty. So let's say, you want to get married. Cool. But understand that you're not going to be charged with the business of the kingdom for about a year, right? So what is Paul saying in First Corinthians? What is he saying in First Timothy? In my very strong opinion. And again, this is my commentary on his commentary because these things aren't even from the Lord. This is his opinion, and this is my opinion about his opinion. If you intend to be in the ministry, if you intend to be a leader, if you intend to do all of these things, but you're taking a new wife every 5 minutes, how's that going to work, right? Let's say you take a wife on January 1st, 2025. Okay, you're going to be not engaged in the work of the kingdom for a year because as far as the Most High is concerned, your responsibility is to bring happiness to her. You're supposed to focus on her. You're supposed to, bless her, bring her joy. Your job is to build that relationship and do those things. Great. Um, so then you decide to take another wife on January 1st, 2026. And then another one January 1st, 2027. And you keep on going year after year after year. When do you do the work of the kingdom? When do you do the work of the ministry? When do you do any of these things? It's not really going to work out. And the amount of times where you get these stories about a young couple that get married and they immediately head out into the missions field, like the next day, right? And they haven't had a time to grow in their relationship, to really bond, to learn the dynamics between them. But they're going to go off and save the people living in mud huts in some village somewhere. And the strain and the tension and the work that they're pouring out for everybody else rather than pouring into each other, and it takes away from the strength and solidarity of their relationship, and it's a detriment to their foundation as a couple, as a family. So 1 Corinthians 7 is confusing because it's like, get married, don't get married. But you should get married, but you shouldn't get married, but you should, but you shouldn't. And it's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And what I believe he's actually saying, he's not trying to prohibit marriage for priests or anyone, but he's trying to help people to understand that if you do get married, you are going to have this responsibility to look after the needs of your spouse. And if you're doing those things, then yes, you are going to have to put the ministry on hold for a while. Now, that being said, when it comes to priests, therefore should never get married. No, that's simply not true. After that year period is done, right, then you are allowed to get charged with business in Israel. Then you are allowed to go out and make war. Then you are allowed to do these things, right? And this isn't even just about wives alone. If you plant a tree and you don't eat of its fruit, you build a house and you don't live in it, you plant a vineyard, right? There are time frames with which you are allowed to, again, um, be the ox that's treading the grain, but also be unmuzzled. So you've planted the vineyard, you've planted the tree, you've built the house, but you're not going to be allowed to enjoy it at all? No. But do you just never get charged with any business in Israel? No. So what it is it's about balance, right? So on the one hand, rules for thee, but not for me. Yes, leaders like the high priests, like kings, like elders and deacons do have a greater responsibility to ask themselves, okay, what does this position require of me in terms of who I marry, when I marry, yada, yada, yada. Yes, absolutely, because they're balancing not only the needs of their family, but they're balancing the needs of the kingdom. 100%. But and we all have to ask these questions. We all have to ask ourselves, okay, what kind of demands on my life and on my reality will it be if I take a wife or if I get into the ministry? Do I build that tower without first sitting down and counting the cost? Right? I believe that's what Paul's talking about. The same basic kind of thing. But at the same time, you don't take the restriction that is put on kings, put on priests, or even elders and deacons and put it on everyone. We don't say to Boaz, because the high priest can't marry a widow, neither can you. We don't say to David, because the high priest can't marry a widow, neither can you. We don't say to whoever married Rahab, right, the harlot, because the priests can't marry former prostitutes, former uh, adulteresses, whatever she was, right? Depending on your translation. And was she forced into that, right? Was she sold into that? We don't know. We don't know her history. But did she become a righteous person in Israel? Did she become an ancestress of our Messiah, our King? Absolutely. But if we had put and imposed that measure of holiness on the entire camp of Israel, then it leaves her high and dry. It leaves Ruth high and dry. After a war where we make bloody battle upon our enemies because they've attacked us, like they did on October 7th or whatever, and a lot of our men are dead, do the young widows just have to, you know, remain in their widowhood for all time? No, that wouldn't be righteous. That wouldn't be fair. And what kind of God would we be serving if we told all of the widows in our people in our fellowships that you can never get remarried. You can't marry anybody outside the camp because you're not supposed to be unequally yoked, but you can't marry anybody inside the camp because we have decided to apply the measure of holiness that is expected of our highest leaders to everyone in the camp because we are a holy people. God never requires it. And it is improper for the traditions of men to impose those things on us because it creates a domino effect of unrighteousness in the camp, right? And then you have these young widows and these young orphans that are living for decades without the kinds of relationships, the kinds of family that they were created to have. Why was woman created? Was she created to just sit alone in her widowhood for 50 years? No, absolutely not, right? Now, can some um, uh, choose to dedicate themselves entirely to the kingdom and do all the things? Sure, right? But the ones that feel like they can't, that they need a husband, that they need to be married, are we just going to tell them, no? Our tradition says that because a high priest or a priest is not allowed to marry a widow in Israel, or somebody who maybe was a prostitute and then came to know the Most High and repented of their ways and did all of the things, are we saying that there's no place for them in the camp? No, there is a place. Maybe not the high priest's wife, maybe not any priest's wife, but to say that they cannot marry in the camp at all, it's not reasonable, guys. So to say that we need to apply this standard that is specifically called out for this particular office to everyone in the camp, no, that's not reasonable. If it were reasonable, first, the command would have come from God and not from Paul. Second, it would have been nobody in the camp is allowed to do this thing. Nobody in the camp is allowed to marry a widow. Nobody in the camp is allowed to marry a former prostitute who was maybe sold into slavery by some wicked, horrible person that slaved her and sold her off against her will, and she had no power, but she was rescued, and she is on fire for the Lord. Nobody's allowed to marry her. Nobody's allowed to marry Ruth. Nobody's allowed to marry Rahab. Nobody's allowed to marry um, more than one wife, right? That's not something that we have a right to add to his word. It's what it is. Now, you may not choose to marry a prostitute, a former prostitute. That's your right. You may not choose to marry a widow. Maybe she's got 5 kids and you're like, hey man, I didn't sign up for that. Okay. But and you may not choose to marry a young Ruth, right? Doesn't seem to have any kids, doesn't whatever, but you're just thinking, well, you know what? She was with somebody else before, and I'm just not cool with that. All right. But everybody praises Boaz for it, right? You may not choose to do any of these things, but that doesn't give you the right to impose this on the average men of Israel, because it would not be righteous to say that Ruth cannot be married inside the camp, to say that the Levirate marriage cannot happen because we have decided to impose a level of righteousness that was meant for the priests on the whole camp of Israel, to impose what was meant for elders and kings and these kind of things on the whole camp of Israel. It's not right for us to decide to do that, because it creates tension with other aspects of the law and judgment and righteousness. And if we're sitting there saying, well, we want to be more holy, more righteous, so therefore we're going to dedicate what we owe to this person as a commitment to God, that's like saying you cannot do anything more for your parents. You cannot give them the honor to your father and mother as he commanded, because you forswore doing that to dedicate yourself as more holy somehow. It's a violation of what he wants of us. It's a violation of the spirit of the law. It's a violation of the letter of the law. But when we get into our heads that we're going to be somehow more holy, and we're gonna somehow arise and ascend to a greater level of holiness than he calls us to, there can be unintended consequences where suddenly we're trapped, unable to do the thing that we're supposed to do. Joshua and the camp, they swore to the Gibeonites, and there were unintended consequences. They didn't realize that they were swearing away their obedience to what God had already told them to do. Don't be like that. Don't be like the Pharisees. Don't impose regulations and restrictions on people that God never did, because you will create situations that God never wanted to happen. He gave us the Levirate law for the average man in Israel to be able to raise up a name for his deceased brother. He gave the law to the high priest that he's not allowed to marry a widow. Right? How do you grapple with the tension? If you try to apply one standard to everybody, either of those standards will result in a violation of the other standard for the party to whom it applies. And that's not okay. So be very careful before you try to impose the standards of righteousness and holiness from one party onto another party without considering the totality of scriptures. Shabbat Shalom.